All right. I would prefer not to speak about the pandemic yet, because I'm still trying to understand what happened and understand what happened in the world, but also with me. So my few comments will be spoken with some hesitance, and also while asking you for forgiveness for the inadequacy of what it will be. We've listened to a few people from the congregation voicing some of what they experienced, and I'm grateful that you were willing to do this. It's not easy, as I've said, yet to speak about it, and some of it is very personal and difficult to bring under words. So thank you. I think we are gathered as people who are fortunate in the context of American society to an extent, but definitely in the world, that we are privileged to start talking about the pandemic in the past tense as we've moved through it. A terrible time that we can recall. But let us celebrate that we are so privileged to be able to do it, and let us celebrate that we can be together as God's people on Pentecost Sunday, recalling what is one of the prominent narratives in the story of the church and in our sacred text in the Bible. We read about Pentecost in the book of Acts, but it's a passage, even though I would have liked Dave to read it, the last few verses of that passage is full of very difficult names, of places and regions. So even though it's appropriate to read the Pentecost story on Pentecost Sunday, I think it's a punishment to our readers to let them wrestle with that. So I gave you an easy passage, Dave. Not to underestimate your ability, but many difficult Greek and Hebrew pronunciations in the regular story in the Bible. Now, Pentecost was an old or an ancient Jewish festival that was probably taken over from the surrounding people that they settled in when they came back, or when they settled the land coming from Egypt. And it was 50 days after Passover that they celebrated Pentecost. Pentecost wasn't something invented by the Christians or the early Christian church or the Jewish movement. It wasn't as if they say, well, we have these people for Passover, let's add another festival to make their trip worth their while, because the pilgrims would come from all over for Passover, and then they would stay on for Pentecost. So it was an ancient festival that people were familiar with. And if you would read the Pentecost story in the Bible, in the first chapters of Acts, the book of Acts, you can skip the last few verses with those difficult names, but just read the story. You will find that it speaks of strange things happening. There was the strong wind, there was tongues of fire, there were an earthquake or the building shaking where they were gathered, and then there were the people speaking in known languages of that time, regular fishermen and not learned people speaking languages that you would not expect them to be fluent in. And there's a lot that's been written about Pentecost and what it means and so forth. I think it is trying to bring under words that with Jesus and his message and the events on that first Easter, that special Passover weekend. That it dawned on people, and the psychological impact was such that they could not really bring it under words, but created this narrative to illustrate that what they've experienced in the message and the life of Jesus was such that for the first time they saw God's world clearly. They saw this picture of a world run by compassion, grounded in compassion, and it is such that the normal paradigms, the normal things that people would do, the regular stuff, normalcy, the way that the world has always been run, was not able to contain this world, God's world, that people became aware of. And they testified through this narrative that when God's Spirit is at work in and through people, things that can only be described as miraculous and mysteriously wonderful can happen. The picture of God's world brought to the people in those days, that special Pentecost festival, an extraordinary time, a picture that they lack the means to fully express. There was another extraordinary time in the history of the people among whom this happened, and that was the time of the exile and return to Jerusalem. Like we talk about the pandemic, a once in a lifetime or the once in history, the exile for the Jewish people was something like that. When Jerusalem was flattened, the temple destroyed, and the people taken into exile. The once in a lifetime event, and what Dave read to us is a description of a view on their return to Jerusalem. And what do we find there? We find words testifying to how special the Jewish people are, how special Israel is. There's a description of the Lord that will favor Israel, and the darkness that will come to all the rest of the people, but not to Israel, and Israel will return to Jerusalem, and other people will serve them, etc., etc. I think a reflection that even in this once in a lifetime, or more than that, once in the history of a nation, even after that, nothing really changed. Their view about themselves as God's blue-eyed kids, the favorites, stayed the same. They were testifying in beautiful poetry in the words of this prophet, the third part of Isaiah, God will favor us and God will restore everything for us. We will return to normal, being God's favorites, the favored ones. In the next chapter 61, we read these beautiful words, and let me read it to you. We encounter parts of this in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, where the author has Jesus saying this in the synagogue in Nazareth. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. They will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, to display His glory. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. This beautiful poem also bears testimony and is in line with the words that Dave read for us. Beautiful, but it's reserved for Israel, God's preferred people. And the exceptionalism of Israel, in their own view, confirmed even after the extraordinary trauma of going into exile, returning as fractured people, devastated families, traumatized people to the former city, Jerusalem, city of glory and the seat of God's presence on earth for them. Nothing changed through the ordeal for them. And as I think about the pandemic and I try to observe and read in the media as much as possible of what is happening with us, on this Pentecost Sunday, and looking at our sacred text and the lessons that we may find in there, I want to appeal to you to take the example of Pentecost Sunday and not of the return from exile of Israel. Don't waste a good pandemic. Let the trauma and the pain and the loss and the suffering and the grief of the pandemic, and as some have said, that gave us reason for pause and to slow down. Let it be an opportunity for us to become Pentecost people, God's people who through the message of Jesus are also seeing the city of God, God's world, the world of compassion, the world that the people at Pentecost testified about, that we have this narrative of extraordinary things happening because normalcy is no longer what prevails, because transformation has taken place and is taking place and will take place in the future when God's people are willing to be Pentecost people, to be the oaks of righteousness, God's planting, the people who are restoring the world and creating a new world. And as we try to fathom the pandemic, may this increasingly become who we willingly want to be, the oaks of righteousness and the people restoring the devastations of generations, as this beautiful poem says, but not to be exceptional and God's favorites, but people who are willing to assume the extraordinary responsibility in the world with dedication, firm commitment, and unwavering. Be grounded in compassion, be guided by God's Spirit, and following in the footsteps of the man from Nazareth. May the fire of Pentecost, as we put what we want to take leave of and what we want to get closer on and move on from, that we put in the fire outside, may that fire inflame us and burn in us, inspire us, purify us, so that we can be people of Pentecost, that we can be and embody God's world. Amen.